what I'm going to do for a little bit of time with you is I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. We have quite a bit of time together. I promise not to talk the whole time. We're going to do questions after that, and then we have some books to give away, and I would love to sign them for you if you are fortunate enough to get a book. And then I'm going to do in there somewhere in between all that, I'm going to do this exercise I do with people all across the country. So hopefully you guys will have some interesting responses. You don't need to write anything, but you only need to come up with 2 words, so it's very simple. But it's kind of like an experiment I'm doing because I've been on the road for about the past 6-7 years, visiting schools in every state. So it's kind of fun for me because I get to, see what different people come up with across the country. Before I start talking about me, can somebody tell me a little bit about Laredo? Because I've never done a visit here. I'm new to this area. I've been to McAllen, I've been all over Texas, but I've never been in a school in Laredo. Can somebody describe Laredo for me? It's not hot today.
Boring.
It's boring? How come it's boring? Is there nothing to do here? It seems like there are a lot of good Mexican restaurants. You guys go to those? So it's boring, it's hot, you guys got to give me more than that. What else? What? There are water parks here? Is a water park where you go and you go in down them? It's like taking a shower. Okay, so I will tweet that. When I leave here, I'll be like, Laredo known for their water pipes, like taking a shower. Is there anything else I should know about Laredo? There's a dirty lake. What is it? Dirty in what way?
Oh, it's green.
It's Is there really a green lake? What's it called? That doesn't make sense. Okay, so there's a green lake. There are pipes with water. Anything else? The tacos are big. All right, so thank you for the information. I'm sure I'll get a little more information when we do the exercise, but I'm going to back up and tell you a little bit about myself and how I became an author, because it's kind of an unlikely story. I grew up as what is referred to as a reluctant reader. Does anybody in here know what a reluctant reader is? Somebody who keeps on reading? It's kind of almost the opposite. So it's somebody who doesn't read for entertainment. Of course, we all have to kind of do some reading in school, right? To pass tests, to move on to the next grade. So we all have to read. But a reluctant reader is somebody who doesn't read for entertainment. Out of curiosity, I know this is kind of like a unique group, but is there anybody in here who would refer to themselves as a reluctant reader? Just raise your hand if you think you're a reluctant reader. So there are a few of you in here too? Okay, on the flip side, just because I'm curious, is there anybody in here who is already kind of an avid reader? You actually go home and you read on your own, outside of school. So a few of you. And by the way, I want to count. Some of you may be thinking I'm only referring to books, but the truth is that's not the only kind of reading. So if you read magazines, if you read articles online, even like things on your phone, like a newspaper article, I count that as reading. So one more time, if you read outside of school, like stuff that doesn't have to do with your classes, raise your hand. Okay, because you know what's interesting? I just told you that I was a reluctant reader, and that means that I thought to be an avid reader, it's somebody who reads books. But the truth is, when I was your guys' age, you guys are in 10th grade? When I was your guys' age, I was reading a lot outside of school, but I didn't think it counted. So I used to come to the library like this every day in the morning, like an hour before school. And I'd come here during lunch too. And I would read, but here's what I would do. I was super into basketball, okay? And what I would do is I'd find the biggest, most impressive book I could find. Usually it was Anna Karenina by Tolstoy or Crime and Punishment. I would open up the book, I'd put it in front of me, and in between those pages, I'd read a basketball magazine called Basketball Digest. Every day I did that. But the funny thing is, I used to think that that was low ball reading. I used to think that that was like, this isn't real reading. I'm just reading about a sport. But the truth is, when I look back at that, I wasn't reading to see who scored how many points in a game or who had the best record in the conference. I was reading the story of how different guys got to the NBA, the things that they had to overcome. So really, I was reading narrative, which is the exact same thing that you will find in a book. So I think sometimes the people who raised their hands and said you're a reluctant reader, like I did, sometimes you're not giving yourself enough credit because you're actually just finding narrative in a different arena. Even those of you who play video games, you're still interested in narrative. Narrative, I think, is the core of our entire country. It's about storytelling. So I'm going to kind of back up, though, and talk to you guys a little bit about how does a former, quote-unquote, reluctant reader become an author. So I want to tell you a few of the things that happened along the way. The one thing I want to make clear to you guys is that it's not, when I was young, it's not that I didn't like books. It's more that I wasn't exposed to them. So I'm going to give you a couple reasons why. So I grew up in a town that is actually very, very similar to where you guys are growing up, except for maybe the water pipes and the Green Lake. But I grew up in a place with great Mexican food. It was right on the border, but it was in California. So I grew up in a place called National City. We used to say we could walk out of our apartments, throw a rock, and hit the border. That's how close we were. I loved my neighborhood. It was similar to this neighborhood where it was about 85 to 90% Mexican American. In my actual neighborhood in National City, it was really good people, incredibly loyal people, good families, people stuck together and looked out for each other. People worked really, really hard. So you could kind of admire your uncles and stuff because they busted their ass. But I will tell you this, there was zero education. So I don't know how it is here, but where I grew up, nobody I knew had ever been to college. In fact, I had never met anybody who had a college degree that wasn't my teacher, all the way till I got to high school. So I didn't think education was a big deal. I thought, you know what, I'm going to do what my dad did, what my uncles do. I'm going to hopefully graduate high school. My dad actually didn't pull that off. He had to drop out when I was born because he was a teenager, so he had to provide for the family. But I thought maybe I'll graduate high school and I'll get a job and I'll marry a good-looking girl and I'll have kids and I'll have a family. I thought pretty much that's what I was going to do. So that's one thing. I didn't think books fit into that plan necessarily. But there's another thing. I also grew up in a neighborhood, I don't know how it is here, I don't want to make any assumptions, but I grew up in a neighborhood that was very poor. And I thought the people who do good in school are the people with money. So I was like, why would I be good at school? I'm from this neighborhood where nobody does good in school. And what goes along with that is nobody reads. So I just thought, school isn't my deal. And then I had something happen to me that was a huge setback, and I gotta be honest with you, this is something I never tell anybody, but one of the most important parts of being an author, and this may sound strange to you, but this is the single most important thing about being an author, is you have to tell the truth. You have to be honest, even if it hurts you. So I'm gonna tell you something I'm a little ashamed of, but I think it's good for you guys to know this. When I was in second grade, my teachers, at the very end of the year, they pulled my parents into the principal's office and they said, hey, look, we can't let Matt go to third grade because he can't read. And when my parents came out and told me, look, you have to repeat second grade, I'll tell you what I thought in my head. I was like, man, I must be a pretty dumb kid if I can't even get to third grade. And here's the crazy thing about that. When I decided that I wasn't smart, I always tell kids, you're going to deal with definition coming at you from so many different angles. For example, think about this. You are going to deal with parental definition. The truth is, does anybody in here come from a family of 2 or more kids? Like you have at least one brother or sister. So most of you. Anybody have 3 in your family? 3 kids in the family? Or more? Anybody have 4 or more? Okay, who has the most? I'm just curious. Anybody have 5? Anybody have 6? 7? You have 7? You have 7, really? You have 8 kids? That is amazing. That is a lot of tacos at the drive-thru. So when you have that many kids in your family, guess what? Your parents are going to be tempted to place definitions on you because it's just natural. So in other words, your parents may say, oh, you know what, Maria, she's my athlete. You know, Ted over here, he's my student. So you're going to deal with possibly parental definitions, especially if you have more than a couple kids in your family. So that's one thing. You're going to deal with teacher definition, or what I call educational definition. So let's face it, your teachers have so many students in their classes. You think you have a lot in that one class that you're in for English, maybe 25, 30, 35 kids. But the truth is your teachers have like 5 of those classes. So that's a lot of students, right? So they are going to be tempted to place definitions on you based on a few papers you turn in. So in other words, this is what I did when I was teaching. If somebody turned in 3 straight papers that were C+ level, I was always tempted to go into that 4th paper thinking, oh, this person's kind of a C+ student. And they're going to have to do something dramatically better or worse to get a different grade. So that's educational definition. But here's what a lot of people don't realize. The hardest definition to break free from is not those. It's self-definition. So once you decide in your head that you're this certain person, it's so hard to change that. So when I was young, I decided that I wasn't smart. 2nd grade, I was like, I'm kind of just like, I'm like a mess up when it comes to school. That stuck with me for like 7 or 8 years. The truth is, looking back, I will tell you this. The problem with me and reading, the reason that I couldn't read when I was in 2nd grade is this. I don't know if anybody deals with this anymore, but it's a generational thing. I'm much older than you guys, but my dad, his first language was Spanish. My mom only spoke English. She's white. I'm biracial. Incredible advantage if you speak more than one language. But back then, my dad, who was a high school dropout, he believed that if we were going to be successful in America, we were going to have to be Americans. Because he thought because he was Mexican, the man was out to get him. So he actually really, really regrets this. But when I was young, I didn't really understand how to navigate language yet because my dad would speak to me in Spanish and I could only speak English. So I think because of that, I wasn't a good reader. Truth be told, though, 2 years later, I was as good of a reader as anybody. It just took me a little bit longer. But still, I had in the back of my head that I wasn't a smart kid. So like anybody who isn't good at one thing, me, school, you try to find other places in your life things that you're good at. So some people find video games or popularity. For me, it was sports. I remember when I was younger than you guys, probably around 6th or 7th grade, I started to get very good at, in particular, basketball. And I remember I'd walk into a gym and I'd overhear other kids saying, hey, here comes that Matt kid. We got to get him on our team. He's really good. And man, that makes you feel so good about yourself, right? So you want to spend as much time as possible in a place where you feel good about yourself. So I played basketball all day, every day, especially in the summers. That's all I would do. And I started to get better and better. And it kind of became my thing. And this is what I thought. I was like, okay, I'm going to go through school. I'm going to play basketball. I'm just going to kind of mess around with my friends. And then when I graduate, I'll get a job like my uncles, like I said earlier, and have a family. But then maybe around 8th grade, I started to hear more and more about this thing called college. And I was like, what is this college thing? You know, I couldn't ask anybody. My teachers had been to college, of course, but I didn't want them to think I was ignorant, so I didn't ask them. And then I remember I discovered one day that my friend's mother had been to college for 2 years. She didn't graduate, but she went to Utah State for 2 years. And one time we were all hanging out at his apartment in the living room, And I followed her into the kitchen. I'll never forget this conversation. I said, "Hey, miss, will you explain to me what college is? I don't get it. Could you tell me what it is?" And she said, "Matt, college is this amazing experience. If you get to go there, you can study anything you want. You get to pick your own course of study." And as a young guy, I remember thinking, man, if I ever got to college, I would study psychology. It's interesting the way people think. And then she goes, "And Matt, if you go to college, you can meet people from all over the country and even all over the world." And I don't know how this lady knew this. I guess it's because I was pretty good friends with her son, but she looked at me directly in the eyes and she said this. She goes, "And Matt, if you go to college, you can meet all these new girls." And I was like, "Miss, I'm going to college." So I went to college to meet girls. Do you guys think that's a good idea? It's an amazing idea. So I had this new goal. It was the first time in my life I had a tangible goal. I left my friend's apartment and I said, I want to go to college and I want to study psychology and meet new people. But then reality set in because my parents had no money, and I was like, there's no way they could ever pay for me to go to college, because even back then it was expensive. I knew that my grades would never be good enough for me to get a basketball or to get an academic scholarship. And so for the first time in my life, I paired basketball and college and thought, maybe I could get good enough at basketball that I could get a basketball scholarship. You guys have heard of community college, right? Yeah. 2-year school, it's like kind of cheap, right? Much cheaper. And then you could transfer to a 4-year. I'd never heard of this. I thought you either went to a 4-year school right out of high school or you got a job. So now that I had a tangible goal, I have to be honest with you, it changed my entire life. And here's how. Because from that point on, anytime I came to a decision, like a fork in the road where I could do this or this, I would always stop and say, which one will help me get a basketball scholarship? So I kind of became more of a straight and narrow kid, got in less trouble just because I had a dream. I remember when I was your guys' age, around 10th grade, I met an NBA player for the first time in my life. I won't tell you his name because it'll tell you how old I was or how old I am. He was at a basketball camp that I attended, and I remember he was standing in the bleachers and we were all sitting on the court, and he addressed us. And I was like, oh my God, this NBA player is talking to me, our group. This is incredible. It turns out he was the most boring speaker I've ever heard, so it wasn't a great experience. But I do remember one thing he said in the middle of the talk. He looked out at us and he goes, I bet you there's one person out here who has a total dream that you will do anything to achieve. He goes, I'm talking to you now. And I remember I thought, oh my God, he's talking to me because I want a basketball scholarship. And he goes, I want you to go home tonight, write your dream on a note card, put it in your sock drawer under your socks. And he goes, then the next time you're running low on socks, you'll see your dream and remember what you're trying to achieve. And I remember after he said this, I elbowed my friend and I was like, did you hear what this dude just said? He said to write your dream on a note card? That's so stupid. I would never do that. And my friend was like, yeah, that's lame. This guy's lame. And I was like, get this guy out of here. I went home after that talk and I wrote my dream on a note card and I put it under the socks in my sock drawer. Why do you guys think I did that? Even though I thought it was kind of stupid. Why would I do? Because I what? I did, and I wanted to achieve my dream so bad that even if I didn't think that this was kind of cool, I wanted to cover my bases. That's how bad I wanted to pull this off. I will tell you guys, I'll fast forward and just tell you that I worked really hard on the game of basketball. I got better and better, and by the time I was a senior, I pulled it off. I couldn't believe it. I got a scholarship. I will never forget the day that I signed my letter of intent, which means you're going to go play at your school for 4 years. My dad, who at this point, I didn't have the best relationship with him. He was one of these silent Mexican fathers. Does anybody have a Mexican father who never speaks? Goes to work, comes home, and never speaks? That's the kind of dad I had. But my dad did this crazy thing. I was going to be the first de la Pena to go to college, and he invited some people up to our apartment, and he said, you know what, we're going to celebrate that one of us is going to go to college. And we had this food and stuff, and my cousins and aunts and uncles were there. And then in the middle of the party, my dad comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, Matt, come here. I want you to follow me." So I followed him down to the hall, and he goes, "I want to talk to you." And I remember thinking, man, what is this guy going to say to me? It's going to be all awkward. We never talk, this is going to be weird. I'll give you guys an example of my dad. He would do the same thing every single day. He'd go to work at like 5:30 in the morning. He'd come home. He'd kick his dirty boots up on the coffee table. He'd work a toothpick in his teeth. He'd drink a Mexican beer because he was very loyal to Mexican products. And he would watch his favorite show in the world. Do you guys know that show, Cops? And my dad would watch Cops rerun after rerun, and any time somebody got arrested, he would just start cracking up. He thought it was so funny. I don't even know why, but he loved Cops. And so that was my dad. And then when I followed him into the hall, he turned around, and this is what he said to me. He goes, "Hey, Matt, me and your mom, we were talking last night, and we never thought you were going to go to college. We're completely shocked." And I was like, "Thank you for the support, Dad." But then he said this. He goes, "But we wanted you to know we think you're a success." And then he took off, and we didn't talk for several more years after that. But I remember as he walked away, I was like, why does my dad think I'm a success just for getting into college? I hadn't even taken a class yet. To be honest with you, I was going there to study psychology, yes, but I was kind of going there to meet new people and do this new experience that I heard was great. I didn't know if I was smart enough to actually graduate. And so I thought, God, that's kind of weird that he thinks I'm a success just for getting into college. And once I got to college, I realized the power of where I grew up. See if you guys can wrap your head around this. A lot of people think it's such a gigantic advantage to grow up in a rich community, like with a lot of money, have 2 doctors for parents. And yes, in some ways, it's very, very much an advantage. But I realized when I got to college that I was lucky about how I grew up. And here's what I mean by that. By doing one little thing, getting into college, my dad had deemed me a success. He said I was a success, right? And that allowed me the freedom of when I got to college to choose what I wanted to study and what I wanted to be based on what I liked to do, not who I would impress, because I already impressed my parents. So I actually now view growing up the way I did in a poor community as the ultimate form of freedom. Because once I got to college, it was all about what I like to do. So based on what I've told you so far, what do you guys think I wanted to be when I first got to college? What do you think I wanted to do for a living? I wanted to play pro basketball. Does anybody in here watch the NBA on TV? Sometimes. Have you guys ever seen me in a game? You haven't, right? So I failed. I didn't pull it off. I didn't become a pro basketball player. There's actually one guy I hold responsible for ruining my dream. Do you guys know who Steve Nash is? Those of you who watch basketball, you know who Steve Nash is? So my freshman year, we played against Steve Nash. We were both smaller Division I schools. And before the game, I've been reading these articles about Steve Nash. It was like, he's this great player. He's going to go to the NBA. He's going to be a top 15 pick. And I was like, if I go into this game and kick his butt, maybe they'll start writing articles about me. So that was my plan. Before the game, you guys know the jump ball circle where they throw it up at the very beginning of the game? We were standing right next to each other. And it was the first time I ever saw Steve Nash in person. And I remember 2 things ran through my mind. Everybody else was shaking hands and saying hello to the ref. And I was just staring at Steve Nash like this, because he was my competition. And the 2 things that ran through my head were this. The first thing I thought is I was like, man, this is an ugly dude right here. Like really not an attractive guy. I know that's a messed up thing to say, but I was only 18 years old. The second thing that ran through my head is I was like, we're the exact same height. We're the exact same build. Why should he be better than me? So we guarded each other the whole game. We were both point guards. And at the end of the game, which we won by 3 points, I did what any basketball player does. I went to the stat sheet to see how I did against the guy I was guarding. And here's the sad part of the story. Steve Nash had 24 points. I had 3. Steve Nash had 14 assists. I had 1. I also had 7 turnovers. It was also the last game I ever started my freshman year. Came off the bench from that point on. So really, what did this guy do? He kind of destroyed me. Even though we won, he really, really outplayed me. And so I went to the team room after the game, and I sat there by myself. And I don't know if anybody in here does this, but sometimes when I'm by myself, I waited for my team to leave, I talk to myself out loud. Does anybody do that? Oh, I'm the only one? Okay, thank you. Your teachers do. Nobody in here talks to you. You don't talk to yourselves out loud sometimes when you're alone? You guys make me so angry. So I had this conversation with myself after the game. I said, man, I don't think you're going to the NBA. This ugly guy just killed you. And then I was like, well, what am I going to do now? I always thought, even if I didn't play pro basketball, maybe or in America, maybe I could play overseas. But for the first time in my life, I thought, wow, I might have to think of something else to do for a living professionally. Of course, I knew I was going to play the rest of my college career because it was a dream come true to get a free education. And I did. But for the first time ever, I thought, well, what else could I do? And so I want to tell you, again, I didn't think, what could I do that would impress people? Or what could I do that would, be prestigious in the world? I thought, what else do I like to do? So there were two other things I liked to do besides playing basketball when I was in high school, when I was your age. The first one is I loved playing guitar. Does anybody in here play an instrument? What do you play, sir? What do you play? You do.
At this time, we need for everyone to please submit your second block attendance. If you have not submitted your first block, please do so at this time. Substitutes, please send the roster with a to the attendance office. Thank you.
So, Mr. Guitar Player, let me ask you a question. Do you play acoustic or electric? Oh, you do. Are you the kind of person who's confident where you could play in front of crowds? Because I have a guitar over here. Do you want to play a song for us real quick? No, seriously, I'll get it. Do you want to play real quick? By the way, you fell for my bluff. I don't have a guitar. But I'm like you. I was not confident to play in front of people. Even though I love the guitar, I could never play in front of you guys. I'll put it to you guys like this. The girl that I was dating in college, she occasionally would come by my dorm and she'd look in my room and she'd see a guitar in there and she'd say this, Matt, why did you never tell me you play guitar? And I'd be like, oh yeah, I play guitar. And she'd say, why don't you play a song for me right now? And I'd be like, I totally would, but I sprained my wrist in practice, so I can't, I'm hurt, I'm injured. So I'd make up all these excuses. One day, by the way, she did the meanest thing any girl has ever done to me. Please, girls, do not do this to a guy. This is messed up. We'd been dating for 4 months, and one day her and her friend walked me back to my dorm. And I opened the door, and I was going in, and she pushed the door open, and she pointed to the guitar, and her friend was there. And she goes, he plays guitar, and he'll never play for me. She goes, you know what, Matt? I've been thinking about this. I don't want to be dating somebody who's hiding something from me. She goes, if you don't play guitar for me in the next week, we're breaking up. And I was like, are you serious? And she was like, I don't want somebody hiding things from me. So she took off with her friend. You know what I did? Do you guys know those little pocket-sized pictures that they have? Like school pictures? They're like this big. I had one in my wallet of her. So after she took off with her friend, I went to my wallet. I pulled the pocket-sized picture of her out of my wallet. I took it with me to the cafeteria. And while I ate my enchiladas, I stared at her picture, trying to decide if she was attractive enough to fight for. And I decided that she was, because she was very pretty. So about 5 days later, I let her come into my dorm room in the middle of the day. I made her sit in a chair like this, because all dorm rooms have this exact chair. I made her sit in a chair facing the wall. The poor girl, her face was like this close to the wall. I sat in a chair behind her, and I turned off the lights. I closed the blinds. I was so nervous before I started playing that sweat was pouring down my forehead. After 5 minutes of pure silence with me just sitting behind her, which, by the way, is a long time when you're staring at a wall, she turned around and she goes, dude, are you going to play or what? And I said, yes, but after I finish, we could never speak of this again. So that's obviously not very good for stage presence. I really did play for her, and we broke up a week later anyways, because I couldn't look her in the eye ever again. So I decided I could never be a musician because I'm too shy with a guitar. So hopefully you get past this. I never did. So that was the first thing that I like to do besides basketball. And now I thought to myself, after the thing happened with this girl, I said, you know what, I could probably never be a musician. I'm probably not going to be a professional basketball player. There was only one other thing I loved to do all through high school, and it was this. I used to sit in the back of class every day, and I'd write these little spoken word style poems. Do you guys know what spoken word is? It's like kind of like slam poetry. Are there any other ways of describing it? It's like kind of hip hop poetry, but there's no music. I used to write all these sort of hip hop inspired poems. They were poems about my neighborhood where I grew up. They were about growing up mixed race, because nobody ever wrote about being biracial back then. But there were also some poems about girls, and there was one girl in particular that I wrote the most poems about. Her name was Julie Gonzalez. She sat directly in front of me in Spanish class. And this may sound crazy to you guys, but every day in Spanish, I was so inspired by the back of her head. This is what I would do. This is no joke. I would write a line of poetry, and I'd look up at her scalp, and I'd study it for a minute, and then I'd write another line. This girl had, to this day, one of the most beautiful scalps I've ever seen. There was just something special about her. So one day, I think it was about 2 months into the semester, I wrote probably the best poem I thought that I had ever written. It was about Julie. It was for Julie. I had never actually talked to Julie at this point. And so we had 5 minutes left till the bell rang for the end of class. And I had this talk with myself in my head. I was like, Matt, you got to man up and give her this poem. This is a big moment for you. You got to do this. So I folded it up. I wrote Julie on the front, and I had 5 minutes to think about the first thing I was going to say to her, because I'd never spoken to her. And you guys know that the first thing you say to a girl is kind of important, right? So finally the bell rang, and I approached her, and here's the first line that I had for her. You guys tell me if you think this is pretty smooth. I'm pretty proud of it. I walked up to her, I held the poem out, and I said, you should read this. It's very smooth. She took it and she looked at me and she's like, what is it? And I said, it's this thing I wrote. Just really well executed lines right there. And then so she took the poem. We had Spanish right before lunch. Now I got to tell you guys, I knew that every day after Spanish, Julie would be met by the same 3 friends right outside the door. I knew that every day they would cross the street, because we had open campus lunch, and they'd go to the McDonald's across the street. I knew that every day Julie would order a Happy Meal, and she'd fill her cup with orange soda, and they'd sit at the table in the window. I don't understand why you guys are laughing. I also believe I heard somebody use the word stalker. Can I teach you guys a very important lesson? You guys may call it stalking, I call it research, okay? So after Julie took the poem, her friends came, they picked her up, and they started walking away toward the street that they were going to cross to go to McDonald's. And so I did this thing that writers do. I didn't know that this was a writerly thing to do at the time, but I started to build the story of how this was going to play out in my head based on the few things I knew. By the way, some of you guys may do this. Have you ever been at a restaurant with your friends or your family, and 2 tables away there's a couple and they're arguing, but you can't actually hear what they're saying? Do any of you kind of build the story in your head of what they're fighting about? You guys do? You're like, oh my God, I bet he cheated on her with her sister, and there's a child involved. So if you guys do that, you honestly, this is no joke. You may have never thought of yourself as a writer, but you have a writer's mentality if you do that. That's all writers do all day. So I did something very similar when Julie was walking away with my poem. I said, okay, here's how it's going to go. Julie's going to go to McDonald's. She's going to get her Happy Meal. When she sits at the table and starts to eat her burger, she's going to open the poem and she's going to begin to read it. And then I said, she'll probably be so moved by the poem, she'll begin to cry. And then I thought her friends were going to be like, Julie, why are you weeping? And I thought Julie would say, you guys, I just read this incredible piece of literature by this amazing man. His name is Matt de la Pena. Do you know him? And then I thought her friends were going to be like, no, Julie, we don't know him. But could we read the poem too? And they were going to all read the poem and they're going to all begin to cry. And then I thought, slowly but surely, these girls are going to realize that there are 4 of them and only 1 of me. And the math is not on their side. And so they're going to start fighting over me, like throwing pieces of burger at each other's faces and stuff. And then I thought, okay, when the bell rings, Julie's probably going to come sprinting out of McDonald's to try to get to me first. So what I did is I call it posting up. I stood against the wall of our campus by myself. I had direct line of vision to McDonald's front door. And I stood there like this, waiting for the bell to ring. And I was like, okay, when the bell rings, she's probably going to come sprinting out of McDonald's. She's going to race across the street without looking, but there will be no cars. And then I thought it would be probably like a slow motion in a movie. Have you guys ever seen a movie where the person running is just like this? I thought it would be like that. And she'll throw her arms out, and she'll get up to me, and she'll tackle me, and we'll fall down, and we'll start making out on the lawn. So that's what I was expecting to happen. And so at first, when the bell rang, I was like, oh my God, this is incredible, because she was the first one to leave McDonald's, and it was exactly the way I had envisioned it. And so she pushed open the door, and she stopped, and our eyes met across the street, and I had that weird butterfly feeling. Have you guys ever had the butterflies? Where you kind of feel like you have to pee? And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this. I'm going to be married by the end of this weekend. This is incredible. I was like, I'm going to beat my dad's record. So she stopped, and she paused, and she looked at me, and my heart was beating. And I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And instead of coming running across the street, you know what she did? She looked at me, and she went the opposite direction. So this was very depressing to me. Not only that was my junior year. Not only did she not come running for me, she never spoke to me the rest of my high school career. Sometimes we'd be walking toward each other in the locker area. She'd look up, and she'd see it was me, and she would turn around and act like she had to do something somewhere else. At the time, by the way, no support from you guys. I thought maybe you would support me with a little, oh, but no support, no support. You guys don't care about me in Laredo at all. Do you know some kids at other schools, they found Julie on Facebook and they cursed her out. So, and yeah, I thank those students very much. She actually had to change her name on Facebook. So now she's on Facebook under an alias. So anyways, so... What's that? Do you know the alias? I do.
You messed up.
I know her alias. I'll tell you at the end. I'll put a secret code in one of those books that I sign. So anyways, do you guys know what a defense mechanism is?
Yeah.
It's when something happens to you and you want to protect your ego, so you spin it a certain way, you know? So what I did is at the time I said, you know what? Julie she's too dumb to get my poetry. That's what it is. She doesn't get my deep poems. I was like, you know what? I don't need her. There are many scalps in the sea. I'll go find another girl. So that's what I told myself. I thought that Julie just didn't understand poetry for many, many, many years. But speaking of Facebook, 2 years ago, she found me on Facebook. And out of nowhere, she sent me a message. And the message said this: hey, Matt, do you remember that poem you gave me after Spanish class? And I wrote back and I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. That must have been somebody else. She wrote back and she goes, you know it was you. I know it was you. I just want you to know I still have it. And I said, listen, I'm an author now. I can't have this kind of thing floating around. Please destroy the document. She refused to. She sent it to me over Facebook. I read the poem Where I Live Now in Brooklyn, New York, and I got to the end of the poem and I was like, this is the shittiest poem I've ever read. Like, now I understand why she never came running toward me, because the poem was so bad. Do you guys want to hear the worst line of the poem? Yeah. Do you promise that you will not tweet this? No. You don't promise? You're going to record it? No, seriously, don't tweet this. You know why? My friends still do not know that I said this, okay? Because if they ever found out, they would give me a lot of heat, and I don't need this heat from these guys. So in the middle of the poem, keep in mind, Julie Gonzalez is a Mexican-American girl, therefore she has a shade of brown skin. That's important to the story. In the middle of the poem, and by the way, I still to this day don't know what this means, but I compared her face to a cumulus cloud, one of those big white puffy popcorn-looking clouds in the sky. Like I said, I don't know what that means exactly, but I might as well have said, Julie, you have a gigantic, white, misshapen face. And that's not sexy, right? So now I understand that the poem was really bad. But I have to tell you guys something else. The weirdest thing is, after I got over how bad the poem was, I also noticed something else. Do you guys know what alliteration is? Who could tell me what alliteration is? Just know that your teachers are listening. What's alliteration? If you can tell me what alliteration is, I will give you 2 books. 2 books. You get to pick which ones you want. Wait, this guy's onto it. What? That, you know, that's close enough. So it's the repetition of vowel or consonant sounds, usually consonants, right? So you just earned 2 books. Can somebody give me an example of alliteration? I'll give you a book. That's good enough. Sammy said smoky. I don't know what it means, but we'll take it. Will you go grab 2 books, any books you want, and will you go grab 1? And I'll sign them later. So, wait, what was I talking about? Oh, so alliteration. Here's the craziest thing is when I read this poem, that to be honest with you was really bad, I also noticed something else. The poem was full of alliteration. I don't even know what that word meant when I was your guys' age, when I had written the poem. But the truth is, to this day, alliteration is one of my favorite tools in my writing toolbox. So the weird thing is, I was sitting there writing a poem about a girl, but little did I know I was actually practicing the job that I would eventually have. So, but the problem is I still wasn't a reader. So when I decided after the Steve Nash game and I decided I couldn't be a pro basketball player and I decided that I wasn't brave enough to ever be a musician, I said maybe I could become a poet. But the problem is, and this is probably the most important thing I could tell you guys right now, if you remember one thing from this talk, remember this. I don't think you can ever be even a good writer unless you're first a great reader. So I still wasn't reading books. That didn't change until my sophomore year of college. So that's why when you guys were raising your hand and you said you're into reading already, I envy you guys because I wish I would have found books earlier because it changed my life. It made me a more interesting person. But I didn't find them until I was a sophomore in college, so I want to tell you quickly the story of when I kind of discovered literature. So I was hanging out with 2 of my basketball teammates. By the way, I was the shortest guy on my team. I'm 6'2", and I was the shortest guy on my team. And I was hanging out with a guy who was 6'11", and a guy who was 6'8", and we were walking through campus. And all of a sudden, this professor that I had my freshman year, she came kind of hustling up to us. And she had a book tucked under her arm, and she said, "Hey, Matt, I was rereading this book last night, and I thought of you. You have to read this." And she held it out to me, and she goes, "Look, you're not in my class this semester, so you don't have to take a test, you don't have to do an essay. Just promise me that by the time you graduate, you'll read this book, and when you finish, you'll come talk to me." And as a young guy, I thought, oh my God, that gives me 3 years, I could do that. So I took the book, and I took it out with me on a road trip for basketball to New Mexico State. And I remember I was like, okay, I'm gonna try to read this book. So I waited till after shoot around and we were back in the hotel room, and I started to try to read this book. And again, I have to be really, really honest, because as I told you, that's an important part about being an author. So I started to read this book, and I thought, why did she give me this book? It's not any good. The narrator can't even speak that good of English. Why did she give me this book? And normally that's when I would just toss a book to the side and say, you know what, I just couldn't get into it. That's what happened to me all through high school. Every book I tried to read, I would just be like 20 pages in, and I'd be like, I just can't get into it. Does this ever happen to you guys? Where you're reading a book, but you're probably paying more attention to what page you're on than really what you're reading? And it seems like you're always on page 8. Or it seems like you've been reading for an hour and you've only gained 3 pages, and you're like, if at this rate, I will be 72 years old before I finish this book. Or have you ever done this? You read an entire page of text, but you're secretly thinking about something else in your life, and you get to the bottom of the page, and you're like, I have no idea what I just read, like not even a clue. That used to happen to me all the time. And that was happening again with this book. But the weirdest thing is I remember thinking, this narrator, she's not using proper English. You can't have a book with that. Like, books are supposed to be proper English. So I was like, this book is trash. Like, why would she give me this book? The only reason I kept reading is because I needed to figure out why she gave it to me. There had to be a reason, so I was looking for it. Something weird happened at around page, maybe around 40. I started to kind of care about the character, which, by the way, I always tell people reading is the ultimate form of empathy, because think about it. You care about these characters that exist on the page. They can do nothing for you. They can't jump out of the book and help you in any way, right? But we care so much about them. That's true empathy, because it's a one-sided thing. So I started to care about her a little bit. I wanted her to be okay. I kind of got into it. I finished about a third of the book that night. The next day we had a game. Played the game, got back. I remember we got back late too. It was like 9:30 or so. I went into the bathroom of my hotel room, because you always have a roommate on the road, and I kind of wanted to read alone. So I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and I sat on the side of the tub, and I read the book from 9:30 until 4 in the morning. And I finished the book. First of all, I had never read a book in 2 days, and it made me feel smart. And as you guys know from what I told you earlier, when I was young, I didn't feel smart. So anything that made me feel smart was so validating. So I finished the book, but the weirdest thing is when I turned the last page of the book, I found myself so invested in the story that I was on the verge of tears. And I got to tell you, where I grew up, which may be similar here, where I grew up, you are not allowed to show emotion as a guy. You have to be tough. It's this machismo mentality, right? I'll put it to you guys like this. If I was your age and I was walking with my dad down the street and I got hit by a van, and let's just say I was really badly hurt, like I had an ankle over here in a bush and like a kneecap over here, you know what my dad would do? He'd walk up, he'd find my face, wherever my face was, and he'd point down and say, Matt, all I'm saying is you better not cry. So that's how I grew up, right? Crying is like illegal. But this book had me so moved that I was on the verge of tears. Before I tell you what the book is called, I want every guy in this room right now to know that I did not cry that day. It was close, but I toughed it out in the end. You guys may not know this, but it's not an official cry unless a tear exits the eye, okay? And what I did, I used an age-old practice, okay? I felt it coming on, and I just looked up, and it soaked back in, and it was all good, okay? So it doesn't count against my record. Has anybody ever heard of this book? It's called The Color Purple. Nobody's ever heard of this book. You have? You have? A couple of you. So The Color Purple literally changed my life, and I want to tell you how. Because I was so into this book, and I remember feeling so many emotions when I read this book, that I thought to myself, what if other books could do this to me too? So that's how I became a reader, is because I went in search of that same feeling in other books. And I will be honest with you, it didn't happen in every book. It probably happened about 45% of the time. But when it happened again, it made me want it even more. So that's why I became a huge reader. But there's something more important too. Growing up as a guy in this place where you can't show emotion, and then or being on scholarship to play basketball, surrounded by this kind of jock mentality where you can't show emotion either, you have to be tough. There was something missing inside of me, and I didn't know it until I became a reader. And the weirdest thing is, this is the way I describe books for me now. Books are my secret place to feel. Nobody has to know about it, not my uncles, not my dad, not my teammates, but when I read, I feel like I'm more of a real person. And here's what I always tell guys especially. Like, a lot of guys I know think that they're too cool for school, they don't read, like, I don't read, like, that's for nerds. The truth is, they want to spend more time chasing girls, right? Or something like that. The truth is, you will be more successful chasing girls if you're a more interesting person, and you'll be a more interesting person if you become a reader. So that's why I always tell people, you are better off being a reader. And it's not about getting a good job. It's not about a profession. It's not about becoming a writer. It's about becoming a more interesting person. So once I became a reader, everything changed with my writing. My poems got too long to be poems. They became short stories. I ended up going to graduate school for creative writing, and I said, I'm going to try to become an author. So for the next 3 years when I was in graduate school, all I did is read everything I could get my hands on, and I wrote so many stories. And the stories that I wrote all featured kids like me growing up and my cousins. Because one of the things that I found when I was starting to read in high school is I found that it was all the books that I was introduced to, they were about people that didn't resemble me or anybody in my neighborhood, and therefore I felt like an outsider, like I couldn't break through. And so the poems I said I write, the short stories I write, they're going to feature people like me and my cousins and my teammates. So to this day, that's what I do. Every book that I've ever written, it features, the main character is somebody like you or you. Because you guys, your lives are just as beautiful as anybody else's. And I think that that should be reflected in literature. Has anybody ever heard of a book called The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros? It's a Mexican-American author who's writing about a Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. And I remember the first time I read this book, I thought to myself, oh my God, she's writing about my neighborhood. And that the fact that I took ownership of the book is why I loved it so much. So my hope is that when people like you guys, people like where I grew up read these books, hopefully they find home. So let me just quickly show you some of the books I've written. And then I'm going to turn to you for questions. And then we have one little exercise I want to do with you. And then I think we're going to give away some books, okay? So my first book is called Ball Don't Lie. It was came out about 10 years ago, actually. I take a lot from real life. And so the main character is actually a very good basketball player. My mom was a foster kid. And in my first book, the main character is in the foster care system because I wanted to write about that to kind of know what my mom went through. This book was also made into a movie starring some people you may have heard of. It has Ludacris, Nick Cannon, Rosanna Arquette, Melissa Leo, and I'm in it for 2 seconds. I'm really good as an actor, by the way, just so you know. So Ball Don't Lie came out 10 years ago. The next book I wrote was called Mexican White Boy. What do you guys think Mexican White Boy is about?
About a Mexican white boy.
Exactly. And what does that mean? What's a Mexican white boy?
Light-skinned Mexican.
What's that?
Light-skinned Mexican.
So some people think it's a light-skinned Mexican, which is possible. This kid's a little darker, though. So what is Mexican white boy if it's not a light-skinned Mexican?
Like somebody that's Mexican but has like the traits of a white person.
You're kind of right. There's in the middle of the book, the narrator describes the main character, Danny, like this. He says, Danny was a white boy among the Mexicans and a Mexican among the white boys. So in other words,
He was too white for Mexican and too...
you're exactly right. You were exactly right. By the way, is anybody in here mixed? Is anybody in here more than one race? What's your mix? Mexican and white. What, somebody else? Are you a mix? What's your mix? Same. So, by the way, you know what, a lot of people don't realize this, but this country, the highest growing demographic is actually mixed race kids. So I see so many mixed race kids all over the country. You know what? They come up to me and they say weird things based on my title. So a kid will come up to me and say, hey, I'm a Korean white girl. Or, hey, I'm a black Mexican boy. People kind of riff off the title. And it's so fun for me because the truth is, like, people are more and more mixed and nobody's really writing about mixed characters. At the school, I'm not sure. Do you guys read a book called Of Mice and Men? Some schools do, or some classes do. So Of Mice and Men is a novel by this guy named John Steinbeck. And I love the book so much. The main characters, here's the deal with him. He's committed this awful, unthinkable crime, and he's sentenced to a year in a group home. couple things about that. First of all, I used to work in a group home right after college. For 2 years, I worked at a group home in San Jose. And I remember thinking, wow, most of these kids that I meet in the group home, they're actually pretty good kids. They just messed up somewhere. But occasionally, I'd meet a kid who was just bad. Like he was, he was just not a good kid. He was mean to all the other residents. And by the way, I hate bullies, and he would bully them. He would also not do his chores. And I'd think, you know what, I just don't like this kid. And then I would go, when they were all sleeping, I'd read their files, what they've been through, where they come from. And that kid that I hated, I'd read about what he'd been through from age 8 to 11 every single day at the hands of his stepfather. And I go, oh my God, how is he even still alive, let alone a good person? So it made me understand that every person that you meet, they have something that they don't share with people, something they're ashamed of, and it's kind of what makes them who they are. So I wanted to write about that. But also, the crime that my main character commits is taken from real life too. One of my teammates committed this crime. It's so awful, but he actually didn't mean to do it. It was kind of an accident, but he still got punished. And so I asked my teammate years later, after I hadn't seen him in a long time, I said, hey, do you mind if I use your crime for this book? And he let me. So if you read this book, you'll kind of see what it is. And I don't want to tell you what it is just because the main character sort of holds it back till the end. He kind of doesn't tell you what he did. Although I will say this, a lot of very, very savvy readers who pick up on details, they know what he did before he tells the reader. So that's We Were Here. My fourth book is about teen depression. It's called I Will Save You, and it's the saddest book I've ever written. It's so, so, so sad. The main character, his name is Kid. Isn't that creative, a kid named Kid? And actually, I'll tell you something about this cover. You see this cover right here? This was the fourth cover that they tried. The first three were dumb, so we didn't use them. But here's where they got the cover. I love this story. They went on, do you guys know what Flickr.com is? Have you ever heard of Flickr.com? It's where you can post pictures, and it's on the web, right? They were flipping through pictures on Flickr.com, and they found this picture. And they reached out to the person who took it. It turned out it was a 14-year-old girl living in Mexico. She was on vacation with her family. They went to the beach. She took this picture of her friend. She grew up in such a poor town that when my publisher gave her $10,000 for this picture, she became the richest person in her family. And so I love that this picture is from a 14-year-old girl, and it's now my cover. So that's that. And then my newest book is called The Living. It just came out in paperback. It's the first book I've ever written that has a sequel, and the sequel comes out May 12th. This book is a little different than my other books because most of my books are kind of quieter and they're realistic fiction. This book is nuts. This book takes place on a cruise ship, and while my main character's on a cruise ship, his name is Shai, while he's on a cruise ship, this massive earthquake hits California. And I was always scared of earthquakes when I was growing up because we heard that the big one was coming. This earthquake creates a tsunami in the ocean, completely wrecks the ship, and now he's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with a few other people and passengers trying to survive. So it's kind of a disaster story. And my goal here was to write a big, more commercial book with a half Mexican character as the star. So those are my books. I also have this, if you guys are going to pick books. I also have this back there. It's called My True Love Gave to Me. It's actually a bunch of stories by different people. Really, really good writers like Rainbow Rowell, who wrote Eleanor and Park, is in here. Stephanie Perkins, Lainey Taylor. It's just a bunch of short stories about the holidays. And it's really, really good. So those are my books. I'm going to turn to you guys now. Do you have any questions about anything I've talked about, writing in general, the books, anything you want to ask? You guys kick it around while I grab some water. Yes. What age did I start writing? Do you mean, did I start writing for real, or did I just start kind of writing little poems? My first novel. I started writing it in graduate school. So how old was I? I was like 23. So I think I started writing it at age 23. Yes, sir. Thank you. How did I like guarding Steve Nash? You know what's weird is he was doing every move that I did. He was just doing it better. So it was very frustrating. And it was one of those things where you realize that I grew up, I was the best player in my school, I was the best player in my region, and there are better players outside of your region. You know what I mean? Like you confront people who are better than you, and it's really good for you to know that, hey, I'm not the best, you know? Although it was very frustrating and sad at the same time. Other questions?
What did you have to study in college? Like, what is it?
I actually studied psychology. I did psychology and English together.
English? How long did it take? 4 years?
It took 4 years, but here's the way I thought about it. I was like, okay, I'm on scholarship. I'm getting a free education. I'm going to take every class possible. So I double majored just because I was like, I want to take advantage of this. I was a better student in college by far than I was in high school. University of the Pacific. It's in Northern California. Other questions? Do I still remember the first what? This could go in many different directions here. What? Yes. He asked, do I remember the first novel I wrote? I have to tell you, have you guys ever heard of this thing called the imposter syndrome? Has anybody ever heard of that? The imposter syndrome, where you actually think to yourself, wow, when are they going to figure out that I don't belong here? Like maybe you get put in the really smart class, you walk in and you have what's called the imposter syndrome. Like when are they going to realize that I'm not smart enough to be in this class? Or you're on a team and you're a starter, but you think, when are they going to realize I'm actually not good enough to be a starter? So that's called the imposter syndrome. When I was writing my first book, I had such a bad case of that because I was like, who am I to think that I could write a book? I wasn't a great student in high school. I was a pretty darn good student in college, but I thought maybe that's too late to become educated, you know? So that's what I remember the most, is the self-doubt. This is going to freak you guys out because the self-doubt led to an amazing stat. When I was your guys' age and I was asked to do an essay, I would usually do one draft. I'd turn it in, I'd get a C+ or a B-, and I'd move on with my life. But to make an essay good, what do you have to do? You definitely have to have a thesis, but you also have to revise it, right? You have to make it better. So here's my question for you. This is a little bit of a trivia question. How many revisions do you think I did of my first book? I'm gonna give you one hint. It's more than one. Who said 12? That's a pretty good guess, 12, but it's more. 15, more than 15. What'd you say? 20 is a good guess, but it's actually more. So who?
23.
35 is the closest so far, but it's more. Who said 40? 40 is getting close. Who said 63? You're the closest so far, but it's actually 104. How crazy is that? I did 104 drafts of my first book because I never thought I could get it good enough. So it took me 1 year to write the book. It took me a year and a half to revise it 104 different times. The reason why I know it was 104 is because I kept track of the file based on the revision I was on. So I'd be like, ball don't lie 6, ball don't lie 12, ball don't lie 102. So the rest of my books I didn't revise that many times, but I've never written a book that I didn't revise at least 25 times. So I do still remember that book. It's like my baby. You know, it's my first book. Any other questions? Yes.
Just like you shared with them about your experience with your first book and when it kind of, made you a better reader, believer. Maybe could you share a book, maybe one of your books, or a book that might kind of do the same
Sure. So here are a couple books that I really recommend, and I'm going to speak specifically to what you've told me about Laredo, because of course different books hit different audiences, right? But you guys have told me about the Green Lake. You guys have told me about the large tacos. You've told me about the pipes of water that are very similar to a shower. You've told me it's boring here. You said it's small. You said it's hot. So these are the things I know about Laredo, okay? Plus, I've also been listening to you and watching you, because you guys may not know this, but even though I'm up here talking to you guys, I'm kind of bored with what I say because I've said it before. So I'm secretly watching you guys, trying to figure out what I can steal from you. Like, I'll tell you this right now. I know who's into the talk. I know who's a little bit bored. I know who's secretly whispering with each other. I know who's flirting with who's eventually going to get married and then divorced. I'm watching all of this, okay? So based on what I know about you guys, here are a couple books that I will I'll throw my reputation down for. The first one, The House on Mango Street. You've got to read The House on Mango Street, okay? This book is amazing. It's very, very skinny, and it's very, very short little vignettes instead of chapters. It's beautiful. Do you agree? Don't you think it's good? Oh, that's cool. So some of you have read it. I have a favorite vignette. If you guys end up reading it, it's called Darius in the Clouds. So if you read it, look for that vignette. It's called Darius in the Clouds. I think it's my favorite piece of literature anywhere. So that's one. Let me think of some others. There's a great book that I love called This Is How You Lose Her, and it's by a guy named Junot Diaz. It's actually an adult novel, but it's super cool. It's written about relationships. It's about a guy, kind of very personal for him, who cheated on his fiancée. She found out and she broke up with him. So it's called This Is How You Lose Her, and it's so incredibly honest. It's probably the best relationship type book I've ever read. So there's that. If you're going to read one of mine, I would seriously recommend We Were Here. The only problem, I will tell you, is that it's my longest book. So it's 380 pages. I know that seems long, but this book is totally my heart. So if you read this, I would be honored to know that you did. Let me think of any other books that I kind of would recommend for this. Have you guys ever heard of Benjamin Alir Sayans? He lives in New Mexico. No. He teaches at UTEP. So he's a Texas guy. He has a book called Sammy and Juliano in Hollywood. Sammy and Juliano in Hollywood. It's probably about 15% of the book is in Spanish. He doesn't translate it. So if you kind of get that Spanish, like, you're going to get the book on a different level. So Sammy and Juliano in Hollywood, that's another one I'd recommend. Any other questions? Any last questions? You guys are bored with me? Okay. My favorite what? Who did I meet? Well, it's funny because one of my teammates, she asked, are there any NBA players I met? One of my teammates was the number one pick in the NBA draft probably about, a lot of years ago. He ended up becoming a bust, but because of him, I got to meet all kinds of NBA players because I would kind of go with him to games sometimes. So I met a bunch of NBA players. What was his name? Michael Oluwakandi. He was known as the Candy Man. He was 7 foot, from Nigeria, incredible athlete, but he's also known as one of the biggest busts in NBA history because he was the number one pick and he never became a star. He played for 10 years, but he never became a star. Any last questions?